Hopefully I figured out how to enable a longer video. We're going to try this. So if it doesn't work, then I have to go back and do it again. But anyway, okay, so we were leaving off with FDR and talking about challenges to the New Deal. He's under attack. So what he has to do, because again, the country demands it, is do more. He's got about half of the unemployed doing something, at least so they can eat. Now he has to fix the rest of the problem. And the truth is, did Franklin Roosevelt end the New Deal? Did he end the Depression? No, he didn't. World War II did. But without Franklin Roosevelt, without the New Deal, what would have happened? Many countries around the world turned to fascism, turned to communism, turned to dictatorships. We did not, because at least a lot of the problem was solved. Not all of it, but enough so that people had hope again that it would come out on the other end. Okay, so first part of the New Deal is relief, immediate relief for food, immediate relief for work programs. The second part is reform. Once he is reelected, he tries to enact long-range permanent changes to correct the problems in capitalism. As we remember, in the early 1900s, there was no control over capitalism. There was no control over anything that very large, wealthy people wanted to do. Now, what Roosevelt is trying to do, like Teddy Roosevelt, is put some restraints on capitalism. He's not out to end capitalism. He is basically out to correct the excesses, to more equally distribute wealth. And we saw those charts from the 1920s. The New Deal is the largest reform in American history. He got $5 billion in 1935 from Congress. And basically what he did, he co-opted his critics. He co-opted people complaining by adopting a lot of their ideas. Remember that there's still a lot of unrest. There were over 1 million socialists in the country when the New Deal started. By 1937, after he's reelected, there are 200,000. So he's obviously solving some problems. The first thing he did to co-opt was poor Francis Townsend, the doctor who had created basically Social Security, a government pension. And Franklin Roosevelt got this through. This is also where Britain and a lot of European countries also adopt basically a Social Security system. It began at $15 a month. It wasn't funded with a tax. It was supposed to be self-funding so that working people would put money aside all their working years so that they could draw on it in retirement. Half was supposed to come from the worker, half from the employer, a 50-50 deal. If you look at your paychecks, you will see that every paycheck you earn in America, money is taken out for Social Security. This is a government program. Basically, it's a forced retirement plan. You don't have a choice about it. In the beginning, they also included children that were dependents that had no means of support. They included the disabled. They did not include farmers and domestic servants, which are included today. They also tried at the same time to get a national health insurance plan through. Congress would not do that. They figured too much money at one time. Problems with Social Security today, there's all kinds of problems with Social Security. The ratio in the 1930s was 40 working people to 1 retired person, which sounds quite reasonable. This money is put away. Later on, you draw on it in your retirement. Today, the ratio is 3 to 1 and dropping. It's a program that's not going to go broke. That's a myth. But it is unsustainable at the current rate. So we have to do something about it. Number one, all of us old people have to die off faster. Maybe coronavirus is doing that. The other problem is there's many ways you can correct this. You can collect a little bit more money. You can reduce payments. There's a cap on taxes over 120,000. People don't pay anymore. So somebody like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates pays the same amount into Social Security as somebody making 120,000. So you could raise that limit. There are many cures for Social Security. It is a myth. It is not going broke, but it can't continue exactly the way it is. Something has to be done. And the more Congress argues about it, they keep pushing the problem down the road, the worse it is going to get. The sooner you fix the problem, the sooner the books will balance. Second thing that Roosevelt did was help labor, help the ordinary worker. Passed the Wagner Act. This was called the Workers' Bill of Rights, essentially. It guaranteed the right of workers to organize in any industry and made owners bargain with workers' organizations. It was not optional. Owners had to bargain with them. Union membership, not surprisingly, peaked in the 1930s. It went from 6% in 1929 to close to 50%. 8 million people, a large portion of the workforce, were parts of workers' organizations. Later on, we added the CIO, Congress of International Organizations, for unskilled workers as well. Roosevelt created the National Labor Relations Board as a mediator to help settle union disputes, to help settle workers' disputes with owners. 80% of those were settled in favor of the workers. Fair Labor Standards Acts, these are all things to help workers, guaranteed a 44-hour week. If you worked more than 44 hours, it was not illegal. They had to pay you overtime. Guaranteed a wage of 25 cents an hour, guaranteed no child labor, no child under 16. Today, we still have a lot of these. Our work week is 40 hours a week, and we have a guaranteed minimum wage. This came around in the Great Depression, in the New Deal. And the fact is today, American workers work approximately 8 more hours a week than almost anybody in Europe. We are still the workaholics of the world. Franklin Roosevelt became a workers' hero, not surprisingly. Public Utilities Holding Company Act established government co-ops, and it weakened the large monopoly companies. Housing, Homeowners Loan Corporation. Again, the government steps in because people were losing their houses. They couldn't pay their mortgages, refinanced over 1 million mortgages. That was 20% of those on the books at the time, at lower rates than private banks. So in other words, the government became the guarantor of mortgages. That ended foreclosures. Today, the government still guarantees. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are still government agencies that loan money to buy houses. Federal Housing Administration was direct government housing. $500 million was passed by Congress for the U.S. government to build low-rent, low-cost housing. And of course, communities and the federal government still does control low-cost, low-rent housing in many places. One of the major reforms of the New Deal, the second part of the New Deal, was the TVA. This was huge. Tennessee Valley Authority. What did the Tennessee Valley Authority do? It was maybe the most imaginative, the most progressive, and certainly the most successful of the New Deal programs, and one of the longest lasting. It proved the government could run business. It proved the government could step in and do things successfully. It is also the first regional planning. If you look on that map, and these are all maps 47 to 50, if you look on that map of the green part of the central United States, this is the map of where the Tennessee River flows. In 7 states, the United States government built 25 dams. Dams are always a win-win-win under the Corps of Engineers. Why? Everybody loves dams. First of all, they controlled floods, so farmers actually had some security on their land. They were environmentally sound. They helped the environment from number one, topsoil washing away. You build a dam, you have recreation because you have a lake in back of the dam. First of all, of course, it created jobs. And these are not 2-week jobs. These are jobs that lasted for years and taught people usable skills. Dams also create electrical power. Most of this part of the country had no electricity before the TVA. Soil conservation was part of it. Bad land that could not be conserved, they turned into parks. So a sideline of this is you're also creating state and regional parks. Government, as part of the electrical program, gave low-cost loans to nonprofit cooperative rural electric co-ops. So from 10%, actually from less than 10%, about 2% of rural Americans had electricity in 1930. The percentage in 1940 went up to 90%. That meant people in farming communities, not in cities, could have a refrigerator, could have a radio, could have lights, could have electric tools, could have electric milkers to milk their cow. Anybody who's tried to milk a cow knows why this is a good thing. They turned the lights on. The man in charge of the TVA dam building project in Texas was a young representative, just new to Congress, named Lyndon Baines Johnson. He literally turned the lights on for Texas. At the end of the New Deal, everybody in Texas knew Lyndon Baines Johnson's name. He was in charge of organizing the dam building. And if you go down to the end of Enfield today in central Austin, there's a dam there that creates Town Lake, Lady Bird Lake today. We have a series of dams upstream on the Colorado River from Austin. All of these, there are plaques there on all these dams that say when they were built. They were built in the 1930s under the New Deal. It was Lyndon Johnson who organized this. He had a good friend named Herman Brown. Herman Brown's great asset was he owned 2 bulldozers. So when Lyndon Johnson started sending out contracts to build the dams, one of the first people that answered the contract was Herman Brown. Herman Brown got many of the dam contracts, became incredibly wealthy. If you know the company headquartered in Houston, Brown and Root, that is Herman Brown's company today, one of the biggest construction companies in the country. Not surprisingly, when Lyndon Johnson ran for Congress, Herman Brown would call him up in every campaign and said, well, Lyndon, how much money you need here? And Lyndon would give him a figure, $100,000 for this campaign, check is in the mail. So this is where Lyndon Johnson got his start, and also Brown and Root. Franklin Roosevelt. I'll tell him, the TVA is neither fish or fowl, but whatever it is, it will taste mighty good to the people of the Tennessee Valley. People were delighted to see the dams, were delighted to see the electric co-ops. Later on, Grand Coulee Dam, Hoover Dam were also part of this development. Hoover Dam is named after Hoover because actually they had set a contract and started planning it before Hoover left office, so they kept the name, but Hoover really had nothing to do with it. Another thing that the reform measures did was help the Agricultural Agency, the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. In 1938, Franklin Roosevelt realized the tenant farmers were being pushed off the land because he was paying people not to grow crops for the first time. And the government made an attempt to help these dislocated tenant farmers. They gave them money loans, they created resettlement areas, they bought up wasted land that farmers couldn't farm and helped these basically tenant farmers try to make a living on this land by selling it to them, or sometimes just letting them farm it for nothing. Part of this was also the Soil Conservation Act. On the Great Plains, 200 million trees planted. They expanded the Forest Service. Any land-oriented projects also expanded some of the new techniques to help farmers become better farmers and more productive. So the other part of this was financial. In the reform, and this is crucial for us today, they tried to reform the stock market and business. The Banking Act basically strengthened federal supervision. We strengthened the Federal Reserve Board, which still exists today. It regulates interest rates, which means that the bank that loans you money is indirectly controlled by the Federal Reserve. Created Securities and Exchange Commission to control the stock market, to make sure that a crash didn't happen again. Glass-Steagall Act, very important. This was FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The government would guarantee any bank account in any bank in America. And again, if you don't have FDIC on your bank account, move it to a bank that does. If the bank goes under, then the federal government guarantees they will pay you the full amount that you had in the bank so that people would not be destroyed like they were in the Great Depression. Silver Purchase Act finally ended the gold standard by using silver as well as gold in our reserves to back up paper money. We created a wealth tax called the Revenue Act. instead of the wealth tax in 1935, raised the tax on estates. So if you died, we call it today the death tax, many people do, but if people died and they had quite a lot of assets, the government took a larger percentage of that. It did exempt agricultural land so that farms could not be destroyed because land was always more expensive than assets. Also taxed profit on stocks. The rate, individuals, up to 75% a tax on inherited wealth and stock market dividends. This was incredibly controversial. It still is. We just lowered it 2 years ago. We just lowered the tax on inheritance. We just lowered the tax on corporations again. Antitrust, he is a trust buster. Department of Justice had 92 major lawsuits regulating transportation. For the first time, air travel, we created a Civil Aeronautics Board to regulate air travel and safety, because now airplanes are a thing. Regulating shipping with the Merchant Marines. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created to regulate railroads and trucking for safety, but also regulating rates so they didn't become monopolies. Okay. Who is left out of the New Deal? Left out of the New Deal were the people who are usually on the bottom of the barrel. First of all, African Americans. Only 1 out of 4 really got help from New Deal programs, whereas 1 out of 2 Anglo-Americans did. Poverty was alleviated a little bit, but not a whole lot. Racism increased. When there's competition over jobs, you usually pick on the guy on the bottom of the barrel. African Americans had 50% unemployment. The unemployment rate at the height of the Depression for Anglo-Americans was 25%. The agencies that Roosevelt created technically were colorblind. They were supposed to employ anybody who showed up who needed work, but often were, particularly in the South, segregated. A good example is the federal housing, and this wasn't done by the federal government, but when the government came in and built government housing, local city governments segregated it so that people were not mixed races in the same housing. Another really good example of this is the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, young males. In the beginning, the Army set up camps and accepted any young man who was unemployed who walked in. And of course, in the South, Anglos could not have African Americans sleeping in the same building as them. So they started out being integrated and very quickly realized this is not going to work. And they had segregated camps in the South. In the North, pretty much integrated. Women. When jobs are scarce, women were replaced by men whenever possible. Their unemployment rate is very high. When they worked, they often earned less than half of what males earned at the same price. We're now up to 80% of what males earn in the same jobs. Agencies would hire women, but the rule was 1 job per family for obvious reasons. So women, unless they could prove that they were the breadwinner, that they had no husband around, that there was no man around, usually didn't get the job, which makes it really rough on them. Social Security did not cover housewives and states set very low rates as well. So women didn't get very much out of the New Deal. Mexican Americans, close to 500,000 when the Depression hits, are deported from California, often by force, rounded up, put on buses and trucked to the border and dumped on the other side. Who replaces cheap labor? The Okies and the Arkies. So the refugees from the Oklahoma Dust Bowl show up in California, and they replace cheap Mexican labor. They become cheap Oklahoma labor. 200,000 of those deported Mexican Americans were U.S. citizens, children born in America. Nobody checked. They were taken out and removed. Native Americans, 1934, the Reorganization Act, actually, this is the point where tribal control is returned. Instead of turning them into American citizens, which they are anyway, they're born that way. Government control was returned to the tribe. Average income in 1934 of a Native American family, $48 a year. So they're still on the bottom, and still today are on the bottom. So what do we get out of the New Deal? Out of the New Deal, from 1929 to 1945, this is really the Depression moving into World War II. But from 1932 to 1940, this is the largest social and economic change in American life. It creates the America that we know today. Nobody thinks about Social Security. Nobody thinks about aid to dependent children. Nobody thinks about subsidies to farmers. This was all created during the New Deal. So if you look at the last slide in that file, you will see the New Deal legacy. First of all, it saved capitalism, still capitalism, by strong government intervention. The government's goal was to regulate, but not to destroy private enterprise. Really, some distribution of wealth, things improved, but it didn't turn the whole system upside down. Huge government spending, huge government mediating in competing interest groups. The second thing it does is expand presidential power. You can understand that quite a bit. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt was called the imperial president. You are creating not a monarchy, but an empire here. Franklin Roosevelt had no problem using great power. He got most things through Congress. Congress was Democratic at the time. If he didn't, he used executive orders. The New Deal coalition, which became basically the Democratic Party, stayed. These are new political alignments. Democrats from the South join with immigrants, religious minorities, racial minorities, and urban areas. And if you look at a map of elections today, look at the next election, urban areas are overwhelmingly Democrat, rural areas are overwhelmingly Republican. 1940, 104 of the 106 largest cities in America were Democratic cities. 97% of African Americans in 1940 voted Democratic. 90-some% of African Americans today still vote Democratic. So the New Deal coalition held. It also the New Deal starts the civil rights movement and the women's movement. For the first time, the federal government not only forced integration, used integration publicly with government agencies, but also, to some extent, helped women. Eleanor was a big promoter of this. Eleanor's two constituents, African Americans and women. Eleanor appointed the first cabinet member, who was a woman, the first woman senator was elected, and hundreds of other jobs in the government. Also appointed African Americans to offices. Franklin was more hesitant about it. It is Eleanor Roosevelt who pushes him, and a lot of these people were her friends that she appointed to office. The third thing it does, fourth or fifth thing it does is push innovation. New Deal was confusing, it was chaotic. Franklin Roosevelt was trying anything he could. A lot of these programs did not work, they were canceled. But basically, try anything. All kinds of people trying all kinds of different programs. So the government became a social laboratory, and the first time the government sponsored arts and sciences and research, which became crucial in World War II. So hopefully if this records, then we are done with the New Deal, which is huge. I spent a lot of time on it. It is it is the biggest change in the 1900s, and we're moving into World War II. Again, stay safe, take care.